You're lying in bed. It's 3 a.m. Your phone is face down on the nightstand. Your mind won't stop moving. You check the clock. You feel a strange guilt, like you're failing at something just by being awake. You've been told there's only one correct way to sleep. 8 hours. One block. Lights out, lights on. But the real answer is far stranger. For most of human history, nobody slept the way you're supposed to sleep tonight. Historian Roger Eckhart spent over a decade combing through diaries, court records, and medical texts from pre-industrial Europe. He kept finding the same two phrases, over and over, in documents that had nothing to do with each other. First sleep. Second sleep. People weren't describing insomnia. They were describing a normal night. You'd go to bed a couple of hours after sunset. You'd sleep for 3 or 4 hours. Then you'd wake up. Not from stress. Not from a bad dream. You'd simply surface, the way a diver comes up for air, and then you'd stay awake for an hour, sometimes 2. What did people do in that hour? Eckhart found records of prayer. Quiet conversation with a spouse. Getting up to check on animals or embers in the fire. Some historical texts even describe couples using that window for intimacy, calling it the best time for it because the body was rested but the mind was calm. Then, eventually, a second wave of drowsiness would come. And people would slide into second sleep, staying under until dawn. 2 sleeps. One long pause of quiet wakefulness in between. Not a malfunction. A rhythm. Eckhart didn't just find this pattern once. He found it in physicians' manuals describing when medicine was best absorbed by the body. He found it in court testimony, where a witness placed the time of a crime by saying it happened between first sleep and second sleep, as casually as you might say it happened between lunch and dinner. He found it in old prayer books, which included specific devotions meant to be read during that middle stretch of wakefulness, as if the church simply assumed you'd be up. None of these sources describe the waking hour as a problem to be solved. It was simply part of the night, the same way dusk and dawn are simply part of the day. Here's the question worth sitting with. If that was normal for thousands of years, why does it feel broken now? In the early 1990s, psychiatrist Thomas Ware ran an experiment at the National Institute of Mental Health that reads almost like a time machine. He took a group of volunteers and put them in near total darkness for 14 hours a night, no artificial light allowed, for weeks at a time. No phones. No screens. No streetlights leaking through the blinds. By the 4th week, something had changed. The volunteers' sleep split into 2 distinct blocks, almost identical to what Eckhart had found buried in centuries-old letters. A period of sleep. A stretch of calm, quiet wakefulness in the middle of the night. Then a second period of sleep before morning. Nobody taught them to do this. Nobody told them to expect it. Their bodies simply reverted, once the artificial light disappeared, to a pattern that may be older than written history itself. So what actually changed? Why does modern sleep look like a single unbroken block? The short answer is light. Specifically, cheap, abundant, artificial light. Harvard sleep researcher Charles Czeisler has spent much of his career mapping how light governs your internal clock. Your brain has a small cluster of cells, sitting just above where your optic nerves cross, that do nothing but track brightness. Scientists call this cluster the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Think of it as your body's timekeeper, a tiny internal sundial that decides when to release melatonin, the hormone that makes you drowsy, and when to hold it back. For nearly all of human evolution, that timekeeper had one light source to work with. The sun. Sunset meant darkness was coming. Darkness meant the body could safely release melatonin early, sometimes hours before actual bedtime, which is likely why pre-industrial humans fell asleep so early in the evening in the first place. Long, dark nights meant plenty of time to sleep in 2 phases with room to spare. Then came the gas lamp. Then the incandescent bulb. Then, over the last 2 decades, the screen sitting 6 inches from your face right before bed. Every one of those inventions did the same thing to your brain's timekeeper. It told your suprachiasmatic nucleus that the sun hadn't set yet. Even though it had. Czeisler's research shows that exposure to bright light in the evening, especially the blue wavelength screens are so good at producing, can delay melatonin release by an hour or more. Compress that delay onto a modern schedule, where you still have to wake up for work at the same time regardless, and you've squeezed a 2-phase, 10-hour ancestral sleep pattern into a rushed, single 8-hour block. Here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. That block was never the natural state. It was the industrial compromise. Eckhart's research points to something else, too. The 2-phase pattern didn't just fade because of light bulbs. It faded because factory work demanded it. A farmer could sleep in 2 loose halves and still tend his fields whenever he woke. A factory worker could not arrive whenever his body felt ready. Shifts had bells. Bells had fixed times. And fixed times meant sleep itself had to be compressed into a single, efficient, schedule-friendly block, whether the body was actually built for that or not. Streetlights extended the usable evening. Factory bells demanded a single unbroken block of rest before the next shift. Between the two, the quiet middle of the night waking hour, once filled with prayer and conversation and unhurried stillness, simply had nowhere left to fit. It didn't disappear because it stopped happening in the body. It disappeared because the culture around it stopped making room for it. But before you get too comfortable with this story, there's a twist inside the twist. Not every researcher agrees that segmented sleep was the universal human default. Sleep scientist Jerome Siegel, at UCLA, wanted to test the idea a different way. Instead of digging through old letters or running lab experiments in artificial darkness, he studied people alive today who still live without electricity. 3 groups, on 3 different continents. The Hadza of Tanzania. The San of Namibia. The Tsimane of Bolivia. Communities with no electric lights, no clocks, no schedules dictated by anything but the sun. If segmented sleep were a fixed, universal human trait, you'd expect all 3 groups to show it clearly. They didn't. Siegel's data showed these communities mostly slept in a single consolidated block, falling asleep well after sunset and waking before sunrise, without a long structured wake period in the middle of the night. Not one long 10-hour rest. Not always a clean 2-phase pattern either. Something closer to one continuous stretch, sometimes with brief natural stirrings, but no dedicated hour of prayer and conversation built into the middle of every single night. So which is it? Did your ancestors sleep in 2 neat halves, or one long modern-looking block? Maybe the honest answer is both, depending on where and when you're asking about. Segmented sleep may have been a specific adaptation to long, cold, dark European winters, where the night stretched 14 hours or more and the body needed something to do with all that extra darkness. Near the equator, where nights run closer to 12 hours year-round, there may never have been enough spare darkness to justify a long gap in the middle. What both stories agree on, the historical letters and the modern hunter-gatherer data, is something quieter and arguably more important. None of these groups panicked about being awake at night. None of them reached for a device. None of them treated a stretch of nighttime wakefulness as a medical emergency requiring correction. They just existed inside it, however long or short it happened to be, until sleep came back on its own. That's the piece modern life seems to have actually broken. Not necessarily the number of sleep phases. The relationship you have with being awake in the dark. Think about what a 3 a.m. waking hour must have felt like a few hundred years ago, or still feels like today in a village with no streetlights. No blue light demanding your attention. No anxiety about the workday ahead, because the workday didn't start until the sun said so. Just a quiet, dark hour. A conversation, maybe. A prayer, maybe. Or simply lying there, listening to the house breathe, with no sense that anything was wrong. Now think about your own 3 a.m. The guilt. The phone light in your eyes. The frantic search for a distraction because stillness feels unbearable. Sleep scientist Matthew Walker has written extensively about how this kind of nightly anxiety over wakefulness can itself become the thing that keeps you up, a feedback loop where the fear of not sleeping becomes a more powerful stimulant than caffeine. The stillness isn't the problem. What you fill it with, and how you feel about it, might be. Some modern sleep researchers now gently suggest that people who wake in the night should resist the urge to treat it as an emergency. No phone. No bright light. Just low, calm activity, until drowsiness returns on its own. It's not a cure so much as a return. A brief visit to a rhythm the body has always known how to hold, whether that rhythm comes in one piece or two. You live under more artificial light in a single evening than most of your ancestors saw in a month. Streetlights. Phone screens. The blue glow of a television left on in another room. Your suprachiasmatic nucleus is doing its best with information that simply didn't exist for most of the species' history, and it is quietly, constantly, a little bit confused about what time it actually is. Maybe that's the real story here. Not that something in you is broken. Not even that there's one single correct ancestral pattern you're failing to live up to. But that something in you is old, shaped by darkness long before it was ever shaped by screens, and the world changed faster than your biology could keep pace with. Public health researchers now estimate that a large share of adults regularly struggle to stay asleep through the night, and a great deal of money is spent every year on pills, gadgets, and apps promising to fix it. Almost none of that industry ever asks the question this way around. Not what's wrong with you. Just what's different about the box you're now trying to fit an old rhythm into. So tonight, if you wake at 3 a.m., try something different. Don't reach for the phone. Don't check the time with dread. Let the dark stay dark for a moment longer, and let yourself simply be awake inside it, the way humans have done in one form or another for as long as there has been night. You're not lying in bed, broken. You're lying in bed, ancient. Waiting, unhurried, for sleep to find its own way back to you.